Namaste, Adab, good evening, Sat Sri Akal. You have started watching Nation India News, and today's program is really important and special because Thenmozhi Soundararajan has joined us today, and we are gonna talk about. We have been talking about caste and casteism for really long. We have been discussing with many panelists, and we have run several series, not just programs or a couple of lives that we have been running several series on this topic. But something has happened last week, and suddenly caste and casteism and the practice of casteism in Google has come to in light, and we have been witnessing casteism massively here in India, but we know very little about how the casteism is being practiced in MNCs, the places like Google, which represent themselves as a liberal organization or someone who really take care of their employee and the people. And we hear a lot of motivational stories and quotes coming from Google about how they have been treating their employee. But something has happened in early week of June, and we're gonna talk about that. Uh, I won't take much of the time because we have limited time, and but I'll just introduce you briefly about Tanmoi. She is the founder of Equality Labs, and Equality Lab has been doing a massive job about documenting caste discrimination, Islamophobia, the violence against the racial violence, and the gender based violence, and not just documenting. It's been also releasing reports and doing work which is backed up by data. So it's a work which we look up to, and we follow and we really appreciate. So thank you so much, Tanmohi, for joining us today. And our second guest is Dr. Manisha Banga. She is social and political analyst, and she's also the founder of NIN. I won't take much of the time and will ask that question to you. Tanmoy, can you tell us about Equality Labs to our audience? Because in India, we have not been, keeping a lot with what has been going in United States, and what kind of, work Equality Labs has been doing in past years. To
Oh,
you,
of
Tanmoy.
course. Thank you so much for that amazing question, and so glad to be here to all of the amazing people watching online. And J Beam, everyone. Equality Labs is an Ambedkarite Dalit feminist organization dedicated to ending caste apartheid, gender based violence, and religious intolerance. And we started this organization as Dalit feminists based in the United States because we saw significant caste discrimination in the United States. Because, just like Dr. Ambedkar said, everywhere our people go, caste follows, and this is a very challenging thing, I think, to explain to Americans, because for them they see us as South Asians, they see us as a racial category. They don't understand that this racial category is filled with all sorts of tensions, including caste. So Dalits are a minority within a minority, and to explain that and to document the harm that we're seeing, that is a big part of the work that we do in Equality Labs. So we do education and research, we do advocacy, and we do cultural awareness and power building. Because, there's one part where we have the data. The other part is, how do we use that data to transform the experiences of caste oppressed people in these institutions that are practicing unlawful and grave discrimination against our people. So that is the work of Equality Labs, and I'm very proud. Even though I'm the one who is speaking and public facing, we actually have many, many, many Dalit feminist leaders across the world. And so to see Ambedkarite women and queer and non-binary people leading this change, this is an amazing thing. And I think we are the best streams of, the Jyotibai and Savitribai Phule. To see, a group of women leaders be able to lead in this way, it's an amazing thing. Oh, and Anwar, I cannot hear you, but one other thing I will say is that one unique area of work that Equality Labs focuses on is this issue of caste in tech, because we are, as an American organization, and we have a huge base in California. We saw that one of the biggest business sectors that had casteism was the tech sector. You know, particularly after the Cisco case, many Dalits came to our organization saying we are experiencing caste discrimination. And, you know, it's all the things that you would normally see in a hostile workplaces, but people were using open caste slurs. There was bullying and harassment of caste oppressed employees. People were facing demotion and siloing in their workplace, even caste based sexual violence and harassment. And when we got so many of those issues from our base, we knew that this was an issue. And so, you know, we really do a lot of research around all the aspects of how caste works in a tech workplace. And that's part of one of our key areas. And it's what people know us, know our work around the most.
Right. Thank you so much for giving this background information about amazing work Equality Labs has been doing about documenting all these crimes and the violence and the discrimination. What I would like to understand from you next is what has been your observation in we in about, like, what has been your findings on the caste being practiced in United States, because we sitting here in India having a very different picture of America, until you share something and we know that no, everything is not all right in what we say, that dream world, or the and especially about the Silicon Valley. So what I'd like to understand from you is what has been your understanding and your observation about caste being practiced in United States.
Well, you know, I think one of the things that is so emotional, I think, about having caste in the United States and really in any of these diasporic countries that our communities have gone to, is in their hearts. You know, our people who've immigrated really tried to leave caste apartheid to try to have new lives in our new home countries. And, you know, as people left and they became doctors, they became engineers, they became business owners, you know, some people hid in the closet. You know, they didn't want to be out because they were thinking they would start afresh. Um, but the problem is that dominant caste people continue to carry over their caste practices here. And I think that was very shocking, especially, you know, and I know it from my own experience with my family. You know, my parents were deeply afraid of what would happen if they would get found out, because there is a lot of repercussions if you're out in your identity. You know, people will start to exclude you from immigrant networks. You know, there are instances, and this happened to me, where people practice actual untouchability against you. You know, slurs and being blacklisted from, you know, different community organizations. And I always remember, you know, when I first started to talk about it, how much dominant caste people would not allow this conversation to occur. There was such a deep denial in terms of even acknowledging how bad caste was, and that it was some phenomenon in the past and didn't exist and all this and that. Meanwhile, we were kept getting cases in Equality Labs from Dalit workers and Dalit families of severe discrimination, both between families and in community institutions. And that's why we conducted this survey in 2016, which led to this report that we released in 2018, you know, called Caste in the United States. That was the first data set that documented caste discrimination in the United States. And, you know, what it revealed was pretty shocking. You know, 1 in 4 Dalit Americans experience some form of physical or verbal assault. 1 out of 3 educational discrimination, and 2 out of 3 workplace discrimination. And of course, that's a pretty shocking data set. And, you know, we are one of the largest groups in the Asian American racial category that faces such high levels of discrimination and violence. And no one wanted to talk about it until Dalit women brought this conversation forward. And people really need to know how hard it was to conduct this survey. At the time when we did this survey, people were very, very, very upset that we conducted this survey. So we would we would table in front of little districts where, Indian businesses or Nepali businesses were. And when we would table, people would throw slurs at us. They would, yell at us, why are we doing this? You're splitting the community, you're dividing the community. We even had organizations go into full blown crisis. Like this one org said, oh my God, we can't do this. If we do this, our org will be divided. And, and yet we were having Dalits from that same organization come to us and say, caste discrimination is happening. Please ask them to do this survey. And so we had to make a presentation to the board, and I'm so grateful for all of the Dalit women and allies that helped us do this survey because, even despite all the difficulty, we finally got a significant data set, and that data changed the world because now no longer could people gaslight Dalits and say it didn't happen. It was there in the numbers, and I think that data set has transformed the conversation in the United States. We had congressional briefings, we had governmental bodies who acknowledged what was going on, and it was really the spark that has really ignited the caste equity movement in the United States, where many, many organizations are adding caste as a protected category. And so our latest win, which is the Cal State University system, saw 23 campuses add caste as a protected category, and it's the largest public school system in North America. So over, close to 500,000 students now can go to school and know that there's education related to caste and that they can be freed from caste oppression. So it's, data really matters, and being able to not just tell our stories, but also being able to enter this realm through the framework of research, and being, those that are committed to community solutions from that research, it is really a game changer for our people.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. The third thing I would like to understand from you is that what happened recently that I talked about while introducing you is the recent row about Google canceling your talk. Like we have radio comments and articles, but what I'd like to understand from you is that can you tell us like more in detail about the background of this, because we have also read that Google in their press release said that we have been doing this for a while, but why this is being and like a issue now. So I'd like to understand from you is that what is the background of all this.
So I think what's very important, for any of the viewers online is really to understand, big tech, is a sector that is really filled with tons of casteism. And, as Dalit women, I think that we really started to think about this issue because, Dalit women, like many Dalit leaders, were the canaries in the coal mine around, what kind of chaos was going on in terms of online networks, and, I know I was like, very early on the internet, on both Twitter and Facebook. And, from the beginning, the minute that I said that I was Dalit, there would be trolls that would come after me and say casteist things. Like I learned so many slurs for the first time that I had never heard in real life. Things like sepoy, or making fun, I was Christian. Someone called me a rice bag Christian, and I couldn't believe someone said that to me, and even worse things. And Dr. Manisha, I know you know this because we routinely face this as Dalit women. And when we saw this, because these kind of slurs were not as normalized in the United States at that time. And so I was wondering, why is this happening? So, I think one of the things that we learned from Dr. Ambedkar is that when you see a problem, you actually have to think about the system that has created it. He was always a big systems thinker, right? So the same thing is true when we think about tech. Big tech started as companies in the United States. And these companies, not unlike, colonial colonial administrations were hungry to get to the Indian market and the South Asian market, and they did whatever they could to get there, even if it meant that they didn't do all of their due diligence related to human rights, to cultural competency, and to make sure from a legal level they had all the compliance that they need to protect protected classes of minorities like caste oppressed people. So as a result, many of these companies have very uneven, biased institutions in terms of caste oppressed people and other minorities. And this is why in the United States there's been a very, very strong battle by Black, Indigenous, and other people of color communities to hold these tech companies accountable related to their practices related to racial bias. So it is within that context that Equality Labs began to look at the question of caste. And our first area of wins was around content moderation. So the fact that you can now report caste as a protected category in terms of hate speech came from work that we did with Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. And when we saw that being able to bring Dalit issues to these companies so that they are held accountable to our people, we started to see what are other areas that the company has bias. And one of the key areas is in the workforce. And we saw with the Cisco case, this is the first time that an American corporation is being sued for caste discrimination, and everything that the John Doe who complained in that case raised, if you substitute caste for race, you would understand this is a biased, hostile workplace. And while that case is unspooling, the things people need to know is that once John Doe's identity was known as a Dalit, that's when everything went south. What he talks about is that, people tried aggressively to out his identity to other coworkers. He was denied promotions and work assignments, and eventually he was siloed and, put off for termination. And this is the same thing we heard from hundreds and hundreds of complaints that came to us after the Cisco case was filed. So, after Cisco, and also after this very painful murder of George Floyd by the police, many American companies made very strong pledges to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And part of that was that they would increase awareness around different systems of exclusion, plus bring speakers and workshops to make all workers feel welcome. And so in that capacity, many companies reached out to Equality Labs because they wanted to make their workplaces safer for caste oppressed people. So as a result, we've seen companies like Amazon and Apple and Dell start to include caste in their HR training. And we also have seen that there's a greater visibility and awareness by HR people around this issue. So it was in that capacity that I was brought to Google, and I've already previously spoken at Google about the issue of caste equity. And so when I came to talk at Google News, it was about talking about caste and newsrooms. And I'm sure you guys have talked about this issue. Dalit journalists have faced the highest amounts of bias in the newsroom, and also faced some of the riskiest conditions in order to report our people. And so we were hoping in that conversation to see how can international journalists better cover South Asia through the lens of caste, and how can our journalists have better access to the world in order to tell our stories. So this was a very simple talk, and it was derailed, ironically, by disinformation, where Google management of Google News could not discern between disinformation and bigotry versus the actual record of my scholarship. And they listened to the bad actors here. And I think, one of the things that, I shared with them was that, like, if you're talking about an issue of racial equity, would you go to Black leaders and workers in the company? Or would you go to white nationalists or the Klan? And this is a situation where they emboldened people who have records of bigotry in order to, deplatform me. And the question here was, it's not just about me that was deplatformed. In deplatforming me, they deplatformed hundreds of millions of Dalits by deprioritizing caste as a conversation within the company, reinforcing bigoted frameworks within the company, and lifting up the bigots as the point to go to around this issue. And this is why this is such an urgent issue, because it's very clear that Google does not know who should be at the table around caste equity. And I want everyone here to make sure that they can let Google know the only people that can weigh in about the issue of caste equity is Dalit people. And that there's no diversity at the table that is not done with us at the table and at the helm of that conversation. And the fact that the company thought that they could do this, the fact that they could create unsafe working conditions for people on this issue and unleash bigotry across the internet around this issue is really terrible. Because I know that in the wake of the Washington Post expose, there are many, many bigots that tried to continue to defame me, continue to insult my religious identities and my caste identities, and even tried to cause me and my family harm. And the thing is that they just proved the case that these platforms, biased companies create biased products. And so if you have platforms where it is unsafe for Dalit people to be there to express our points of views because bigots want to go after us, that's not on me. It's really on the company that enabled those bigots. And this is why it's very, very important for every, Bahujan that is listening here right now. It is time for us to let these companies know they cannot create products without us at the helm, and that we have to decide and create around our safety, because we too are part of the future. In fact, and from a business perspective, all of these companies want to capture the South Asian market because they want what they call the next billion users. Those are the people that have yet to come online. Well, the majority of those next billion users are our people only. Why do our people want to come into a casteist internet? Why do our people want to come into a place where people openly use slurs and think that they can torment our leaders through discriminatory terms? This is unacceptable. And that's why there are workers that are fighting for us in every single company, saying they want caste as a protected category. They want caste oppressed people to be able to access workplaces free and safe from harm, just like all workers, and that caste equity is a worker's right. And this is really coming from this moment. And so I just want to encourage people. I know some people reached out to me and they felt a little bit discouraged, or they felt, really sad. I mean, if it could happen at a company of Google, like, can we actually ever fight? And I want to encourage everyone, we are fighting. We are winning. Imagine right now, there are more people in the world talking about the issue of caste in corporations and what's happening around caste discrimination because of what occurred. And so, take heart. This is a battle that we are going to win. And this is, every time we speak up on this issue, every time that we fight, we get stronger. And so I feel so, empowered by the love and the strength of our community and the unity that we're building around this issue. So we are just getting started. And, I know particularly because most people underestimate Bahujan and Dalit women. They always underestimate us. But though we might be tiny, we are very mighty and we are strong all around the world. So I have no doubt that we are going to win this.
Absolutely.
I'm so excited.
Talking about fight, Equality Labs has also like recently published a letter, accountability letter, asking Google to do some reforms in the organization. Can you tell our audience how caste is being practiced specifically at Google? And also would like to understand, our audience like to understand what has been the case of Tanuja Gupta. Can you also talk more about that the resignation followed?
Well, I'm going to actually, just focus on the caste issues because, Tunisia's in, her own process for this moment right now. But, I think what's very important for people to understand with the issue of caste is that, it's not unlike, what we had to deal with in terms of, when caste was written about in scriptures, where we had no access to the laws that were actually governing our whole lives, right? And this is the case with big tech. It's all around us, right? We have it touch every part of our lives. But how many of us actually know what goes on in these companies? How many of us have actually ever looked at the code and understood what bias might be there, So it actually takes a very like systemic lens. We have to be like Dr. Ambedkar now more than ever, and not just accept the discrimination that we're seeing, but look at all of the aspects of the company. So, one of our asks was not only to add caste as a protected category, but also ask for an audit to understand the level of caste harm within the company. And people may not have known this, but this is actually, a strategy developed by civil rights organizations like Color of Change and Media Justice in the United States. But these audits are a way to basically have a third party look at the company in all of its different realms that it works to understand, are you biased or not on these issues? Right. And so in a company like a tech company, there are a lot of areas that caste might exist. The first one, which is like what we're looking at in this conversation, is that of HR and workplace dynamics. So that's looking at, the level of discrimination that exists, how also the diversity of the staff, and not just the diversity of, the regular staff, but also diversity in management and those that are in the C-suite or in leadership. There's also areas where caste impacts the product. So is there bias in the algorithms or the codes? Is there bias in terms of the ways people approach moderation? And this was actually how we first started on this issue, was we saw so much caste slurs normalized on the platform. And when you actually started to talk with the company, some of the companies didn't even know the word caste, and they were operating in South Asia. Can you imagine? So that kind of, unlawfulness is what was going on with a lot of these companies. And so I would really love to know a little bit more about bias within the project's, executions. There's also looking at how caste might operate in terms of its own advocacy. There are many American corporations, for example, that say one thing in their PR about diversity, but then they fund political candidates and issues that are actually contrary to diversity. So you do an audit of the company's advocacy with relationship to human rights and in our case, like caste equity. So these are just some of the areas that we can look at with relationship to an audit, but that's why we're asking for it. Because if a company hasn't actually added caste as a protected category, then we don't know what's going on at all in terms of how much harm has occurred. So this allows us to go inside and be able to do that through a legal form. And it's a very recognized UN process to do these kinds of, the UN has a whole thing called, the Human Rights Impact Audit Assessment under their policies related to socially responsible businesses. And so this is like a model that we'd like to be able to see here. And then the other thing that we're asking for is investments in diversity and equity and inclusion commensurate with other protected categories. And, this, for Google, for folks that don't know, they approach diversity from this framework where they say from cradle to career, which means if they're not getting enough people walking in through the door that are coming from diverse backgrounds, they wanted to intentionally make investments in college, in K through 12, in tutoring, apprenticeships, scholarships, and then also once people are through the door, really making very strong commitments related to, once someone is in through the door, how can they then come up through the ranks in terms of management? So this is not like a new process. And in fact, every single American corporation has made these aggressive measures. It is pitiful, though, that Indian corporations have not done that. Like there is some, data that shows how bad, caste hegemony is within the corporate context. But, I'll always remember, like the startling statistic, which is that Indian corporations have a 0% rating. A 0% rating when it comes to diversity related to caste, because at the board level, there are very few companies that have caste oppressed people at the board level. We're not talking about entry level. We're talking about at the board level. So we have a lot of work to do, and there is an amazing, new generation of caste oppressed diversity and equity and inclusion leaders who are really fighting to transform corporate culture. And I think this is such an important battle for us to take forward, because again, when you think about the fact that oftentimes discussions of caste are really relegated to issues of atrocity, we know that our people are actually doing our best to basically come up as much as we can. But as soon as we come up and go into institutions, if we also experience harm in those institutions, we derail an entire lifetime of progress. And that's why but in India, there's actually laws to prevent discrimination. And even if they're not implemented, it's our job to fight for that implementation. So this is a moment, for people to not use this as just a conversation about caste in tech, but also caste in corporate culture. And many people who are dominant caste that have been in HR have tried to deny how prevalent caste discrimination is. But we want to really assure workers that are facing this, we see you. We know that this is happening, and it's time as a community that we back up all of our workers and all the workspaces that they're in so that they can thrive wherever they might be.
Thank you so much, Tanmay, for explaining this and giving our audience an insight about what has been happening at the corporates. About we rarely talk about caste in corporates and how these things functions, especially in US. Thank you so much for giving us the time. The final question I would like to ask Dr. Manisha Bangar before we wrap up this session is how do you see this recent episode at Google? And I also would like to understand from you is that do you think that this whole Savarna thing at abroad overseas, and do you think they have any role to play? Or I mean, like we know that there is a lot of funding and there's a lot of investment, and we also see when someone some Hindutva elements or the figures goes to US, the kind of gestures they receive there. So I'd like to understand from you is that what kind of role they are playing in strengthening the militant ideology, the Hindutva militant ideology in India, and but the first question would be understanding you that how you see this entire episode of the Google, and then the second part.
Yeah. So the second part of the question is a little more elaborate. So I don't think I'll be touching much upon it, Anwarul. But sticking to the today's topic, what I feel is very unfortunate that almost we have, say, if you say it from the time that liberalization and globalization and privatization has come in India, we have almost 2.5 decades of time and more than that which has gone past by, and there are so many articles, so much of studies, and so much of literature which has come, personal experiences. It's shown that diversity enhances the production. It leads to diversity of all kinds, of all the oppressed communities, those who have never been giving any representation. So this damning of intellect, this damning of opportunities, this cornering of opportunities, which has been going for thousands of years, as can be seen that after 1950, with the simple introduction of certain safeguards, that has resulted in such a outgrown and such a effervescent manifestation of so much of energy in terms of the SC, ST, OBCs, especially the Dalits, SCs, coming forward in each and every field of life. And this forms the primary basis, even in the tech world, even in the corporate world. Capitalism per se believes in the fact, and it is capitalism as such is it's a neutralizing factor. It is something which is open to all, irrespective of where they are born, and that is how the proponents of capitalism market it, and they want to forward it. And in fact, market actually is a neutral entity, but then it's not the whole truth. Market and market open economy uh, can also be modified, or it can be again restricted, as we can see, if it is topped by restricting ideology or a restricting system that we have in place. It absolutely resonates the same view that Dr. Ambedkar spoke about when he was speaking to the trade unionists way back in the 40s, late 40s, and even in the late 30s, that it's not only a caste system, but the capitalism that we have to overcome, but it's a caste system combination of the Brahminism, caste system, and capitalism. Because Brahminism and caste system together, it really prevents capitalism from coming to its bloom and making itself accessible to each and every person. So hereby, we are not only decreasing the production, we are decreasing the talent, we are damning the talent, we're restricting the talent, and we are totally suppressing an entire generation of people. This is something that the capitalists of USA and the Western world need to know, that how detrimental the caste system it could be. Just playing an ostrich, recognizing only race, when the American black population forms about less than one third of their population, and the South Asian community is slowly rising to the same degree, almost occupying a sizable amount of their population in the US. And also, uh, at some places and in many of the companies, these people are actually replacing even the Americans themselves. As you see in the higher echelons of the various companies, it is the upper caste and the Dvijas from India who are heading these board members, and also the board companies and everything. I know, don't need to talk about how Indian corporations are also making inroad into the US economy. That is a separate thing, but it also has a lot of bearing on it. If those things are taken into consideration, then it really spells doom if the casteist mindset, the discriminatory mindset, the Hindutva mindset remains as it is. And we've seen that, unfortunately, it has remained. And pushing it under the rug, not talking about it, and then actually suppressing each and every effort when it is being talked about is not the way to go forward, is what the various people need to understand. However, when speaking to these people in the American public or the European public, when we talk in terms of uh, you know the agency that promotes casteism, and the agency which eulogizes the caste system in some way or the other, their characteristics also have to be exposed and told to these people, that how tenacious these people have been. And therefore, this particular system of understanding caste, being able to pick up casteist environmental issues, pick up subtle casteism in workplaces, and gender discrimination, and casteist plus gender discrimination is very, very important. It's a good thing that many universities in the US are picking it up. And whatever the case may be, it's also true that what is being enunciated in the Western liberal space and the Western this thing has a bearing on what is going on in the corporations in India. How much, if at all, is going to be adhered to in Indian perspective, we do not know. We have our own struggle to take care of, and we have to do that struggle here. But then understanding the nuances and see how both the things are linked is very, very important to those who are struggling in India and those who are struggling there. It's not without little attention that we've seen almost 50 years of space has gone in which the unhindered presence of upper caste Dvijas has literally dominated each and every place in the US, right from the polity to universities and things like that. Recently, there was an incident in which American white women exposed the Brahmin ladies in the academia, and she was hounded for that. But I think she spoke the truth, that yes, women, upper caste women, the Dvija women, um, uh, they exactly behave the way the upper caste men behave, and these nuances and these things have to be highlighted. Protecting the caste system is in the interest of the Dvijas, and they have been always eulogizing it. They will eulogize, but then systematic understanding the system and having the protections in place is something is the way to go forward. Auditing, of course, is very important, because unless we audit, we wouldn't know how far we have come. And everything has to be this. These things have to be brought in the domain of science, I guess so, in the domain of statistics, in the domain of actual sociological understanding of these things. Caste is not something new. It has been talked about in Durham, in many more places, and it's high time that the corporations in US, they understand it and also make it mandatory, and they have the same review system for the corporations which are operating in the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia. Anwarul.
And
Thank you.
also, Anwar, if I
Yes,
could just add to that,
yes, yes, please.
I must say that, like, for our team, like, we are, very indelibly, in debt to the work of researchers like Dr. Sukhdev Thorat, who showed us the way that data really can transform institutions. So in India, corporations that are trying to grapple with this should really consider partnering with the Indian Institute for Dalit Studies, because, again, like Dr. Manisha said, discrimination can actually be defeated with science and sociology. It's not a mystery how to stop it.
Right.
We just have to study it to be able to set our data, to get a set of data to be able to understand what we might transform. But the only other thing I wanted to add to what Dr. Manisha spoke about is that I think that people need to really understand, that many of the South Asians that have come to the United States came because of contributions and the fights of civil rights movements. So in the 1970s, immigration law was changed to finally allow significant immigrants from around the world to travel. And many of our hires within companies are also results of battles for affirmative action, which is the reservations policy in the United States for people of color. So the fact that many dominant caste people are beneficiaries of reservation in American companies, but then come to chastise our people around the issue of reservations in those companies, shows the weird cycle of bigotry that goes on with dominant caste people in corporate spaces. And so, in many ways, like, we have, our solidarity in this conversation really have to be with other Black and immigrant and people of color workers. And many of these companies, and Google as an example, has a history of treating Black workers very terribly. So, an anti-Dalit mindset leads to an anti-Black mindset. So we should always be correct in terms of our solidarity with BIPOC communities, and also acknowledge that the hypocrisy that goes on in the Savarna mind, that allows them to climb up the ladder and then pull it back behind them and then torment Dalit people once they get into the workplace. That's the sickness. Oh,
You
Dr.
are not.
I can't hear you.
Yeah. So I also want to make a point about the hypocrisy, because here the anti-reservation brigade and the anti-affirmative action brigade is nobody else but the entire upper caste, upper class people, the Dvijas, making use of the diversity opportunities in US, and then going against the diversity principle
Yeah.
totally, to take out the Dalits and the SC, ST, OBCs and the Muslim minorities out of the fold is hypocrisy of the highest order. And it's a very malicious attempt. Actually, it's beyond hypocrisy. It's very malicious. So yeah, that is, I also wanted to make that point. Yeah, thank you, Anu.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tanmoy and Dr. Manisha, for adding your valuable comments. That really, give us an interesting and important insights to our audience about how caste functions in corporates. We have been talking about, like I've said this earlier, that we have been talking about caste, in our neighborhood, in the religious places, in the schools, and everywhere. But we miss to look at, how caste thrives, not just function but thrives in the corporates, and especially in the MNCs, who promise to be like fair to all, to be fair and to give proper representation to all social groups. Thank you so much, Tanmohi, for giving us insight about how caste.
Is
Yes,
it
yes, yes,
possible? Could I say one other thing?
yes, 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 please go ahead.
So before we end, I also just want to put out a call around this idea that, oftentimes we think about only the fight for caste as one that's only political and economic in nature, which it very much is. But I also want to say there is a call here for us now to come together to heal. We often don't talk about caste as a thing that we need to heal from. But when you look at the way dominant caste people react around this issue, the fact that you had several people write in that I feel unsafe if caste is to be discussed. Imagine that. They are talking about feeling unsafe while our people are actually literally feeling unsafe because we are facing, hate crimes, caste-based sexual violence, and being, tormented at the workplace. For them, it's simply a conversation that makes them afraid. And when you think about it from that perspective, there's actually a whole body of work that Black somatic practitioners have started to do around racial equity, where they're saying, you know what, it's not about workshops, it's not about books. Like if you think about us in the caste context, how many volumes did Dr. Ambedkar write? Honestly, if any dominant caste people wants to unlearn caste supremacy, the knowledge is already there. And yet casteism continues. And so what our Black, solidarity movements are saying is you have to go to the nervous system. You have to go right down to the psychology and the mindset of why is it that people of privilege feel so unsafe when equity is at the table. And that really requires thoughtfulness about your mind, your body, and spirit, and a mindfulness practice to be able to let go of those things, those unhealthy lessons that you've learned about why Dalit people are so fearful for you and equity is so fearful for you. And when we start to approach the lens of caste through that of healing, one thing that I've seen is that there are many dominant caste people who are willing to shed their privilege much more easier. And this is a time where I think that we can create a very strong intercaste, multiracial, interfaith movement that can challenge these dominant caste networks. Because the thing is, nobody wants to live in the world that they create. Who wants to live in a world where people are routinely passed off as slurs and where things are set on fire and you literally feel sick all the time because discrimination is happening? I don't want that world. I want a world where I can live in joy, live in possibility, live in freedom. I want to live in Begumpura. I want to live in Ambedkar's world. I want to live in that radical future. And that comes when you center Dalit feminist thought. It comes when you center healing. And it comes from us saying no to bigotry, no to discrimination, no to harassment, but yes to life, yes to each other, and yes to a caste abolitionist future. So I know a lot of people are just looking forward to how we fight together. And I also want to add, let us heal together. Let us heal from this wound of caste and let us fight for that caste liberatory future together. And that's why it's such an honor to be here with Dr. Manisha, because she has been one of those amazing Bahujan feminist leaders that has really talked so much about the ways that we can find hope. And, there's a reason why she's a doctor, because she knows about what it means to heal people and to also heal ourselves from this discrimination. So I want to leave people with that moment of hope, because the future is ours. We just have to take it.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Let's hail together. We are running out of time, so we need to finish this live segment. But I would really love to have you again on our platform to talk more about it. This is one of the things we have talked, but there are so many aspects around caste and casteism in India and of course overseas. But again, thank you so much for giving us your time. uh, Thank you. We are closing this live and hope to see you again soon. Thank
Thank
you.
you so
Jai
much.
Bhim and Jai Savitri, everyone.
Jai Bhim, Jai Savitri. Thank you so much.